owe around 26 million back to investors.
Remember that Netflix documentary, Fyre? Billy McFarland, the infamous entrepreneur, the catalyst to the catastrophe, convicted fraudster, sentenced to 6 years in federal jail.
It was basically the exact opposite of everything we were promised.
Seeking damages in excess of $100 million.
Now he's out.
Do you think it's really possible to change? Like when it's so in you, you know?
Now I was sentenced to 6 years. I just couldn't fathom like how long that period of time actually was. It really took probably a full year of being in jail to start reflecting on the purpose and the why. In some physical way, I was stripped down to nothing, but also mentally, it was like a slap in the face of what's important. Lost a lot of friends, lost a lot of supporters, and it was much harder to kind of get back to a real solid support system than I expected it to be.
Is the intention to do the Fyre Festival again?
Hi guys, I'm Charley Law and welcome to the podcast. We're going to be speaking to all sorts of people about how they've managed to make real, hardcore, tangible change to their lives, be it personally, professionally, physically, or emotionally. It's my biggest fear in life to have regrets and unfulfilled potential. So I want to understand what my guests actually did. What was that moment that sparked change? And what really made the difference? What nuggets, what tools, what resources, what disciplines, secrets, non-negotiables actually moved the needle, enabling them to navigate adversity, make change, and build a better life for themselves. Please enjoy. Let's get into it.
So, you know, Billy, I reached out to you because, like so many people, I watched that infamous Netflix documentary. Yeah. And I even had a few of my mates that were stranded in Bahamas and ended up in Miami. They had an okay time in Miami in the end. But I remember towards the end of the documentary that it was quite clear that there were people pretty fucked off with you. And I think, yes, the investors and yes, the people that, you know, couldn't attend and they bought their tickets, but where the real anger and hurt was from those people that were close to you, your family and friends and close associates. And it was the abuse of trust and that abuse of the human trust that kind of helps make the world go round. Clearly, there was someone there that was out of his depth, deluded, all sorts of things. You got convicted to go to jail, and I believe you were sentenced to 6 years in jail. But since you've come out of jail, you know, I've listened to a few of your interviews and seen a little bit of your content online, and it hasn't been a lot, but it's been enough. And from my own intuition, having experienced making some fuck ups in my own life, not comparable to yours, but some fuck ups and being a bit deluded myself and having to eat some humble pie and go through a process of self-awareness and change. From what I heard in the interviews and from my intuition, my gut tells me that, you know, there's some serious behavioral change and work and self-awareness and humility that's gone on behind the scenes. Now, you know, yes, you might be deluding us all and actions speak louder than words, but this podcast is very much about making change. And potentially you were so far gone one way. If you're able to sort of swing back the other way and make a seismic change, then you are absolutely the person that I would love to interview to really understand how the fuck can someone come from all the way over there to all the way over here. So that's why I wanted to get you onto the pod and sort of dig into a little bit, you know, what's been going on below the surface. But let's just start off with, talk me through towards the end of when the shit was hitting the fan. You were on bail, you decided to continue fraudulent activities, selling fake tickets. Your friend was talking to you about jail time. You were laughing at that, the idea of going to jail. Like, just talk to me about those sort of closing months before the reality hit.
Sure. So I think the one thing you hit on that is really, really important here is the violation of trust. And when I had time to think about what was the real crime that I committed, the crime that I committed was abusing the trust of family, of friends, of employees, of supporters. And that was the hardest thing to come to terms with. And it's also the biggest motivating factor is I want to walk into a room where people trust me. I'm the first and last guy they trust and really driven by that. And right now I'm often in the complete opposite of that situation, which is super, super frustrating, but also super motivating. So yeah, I appreciate you quickly realizing and pinpointing that trust violation as probably the biggest ethical violation, but also the biggest criminal violation in my mind there as well. So the closure of the festival was totally caused by me and kind of the biggest emotional whirlwind and something as a deluded 25-year-old I was not prepared to handle. And I distinctly remember this moment where the day of the festival, I woke up and had, hundreds of employees, hundreds of text messages, phone calls, emergencies, solutions, problems, purpose, and really had a drive and understood what I at least thought I had to do. And when I came back to New York after the festival failed, I woke up the next morning and no one called my phone. And it was the first time since I was 12 years old where I had no employees and no purpose and no fires. And it was just the weirdest, most isolating feeling. And in some really weird way, I just stranded hundreds of ticket holders on the island, but I also stranded myself on this semi-permanent island where I was untouchable. I was lava. No one would reach out to me. And I went through this period of months trying to comprehend, A, what was happening next, which subconsciously I knew with jail time, and B, trying to understand how my life was forever changed, where instead of waking up every day with a team and a family that I was fighting with, I was now alone on this metaphorical island, and I was not prepared mentally to handle all of that.
You said subconsciously you knew you were going to jail, but I just wanted to understand what was going through your head a little bit when you were on bail for the first crime, and then you you assumed that you would never go to jail. And what was going through your mind when you thought, right, let's just start up, another business and start selling fake tickets?
Yeah, the whole business ticket aspect is really hard for me to come to terms with. There's no excuse. It was so incredibly stupid. And I was driven by part fear of what's going to happen if I don't find the funds to pay back the people that I screwed. And B, just like deluded thinking I can still pull this off. I can get access to these events and I can make people happy and I can show them that I am this person that I was trying to present myself to be prior to the failure of Fyre and Fyre Festival. So looking back now, and obviously with 5 minutes of reflection, it is very easy to see how ridiculous and stupid it was. But at the time, I was still caught in this tornado of fear and delusion that just created this storm of really, really bad behavior.
I watched the Jason Calacanis interview, and he spoke about the importance of having a great co-founder, and potentially if you had a good co-founder, this would never have happened. But at that time, was there no one around you, no one in your circle saying, Billy, should you really be doing this? Or were you just shrugging everyone off?
I was certainly shrugging people off, but I also think it was a reality that the failure of the festival and the fact that it clearly lied to raise money for the festival and the collapse of that scared off most of the people who I truly needed around me. So I was definitely isolated, but my behavior was attracting people who were attracted to that kind of bad behavior. And I think that's like one of the biggest lessons that I've learned on a practical level is that just like your mindset and your behavior is so impactful on who you attract and bring around you. And people with bad intentions attract people with bad intentions, and people with good intentions attract people with good intentions. And I think I just didn't understand that and was putting myself in a really, really bad situation based on, my stupidity and my behavior.
Yeah, I remember in the documentary, there was a guy that had done a few months in jail, and he was sort of saying to you, mate, 23 and 1, that's what it starts off like. And you were sort of laughing off the idea of going to jail. Just talk to me a little bit about when you were sentenced to 6 years in jail. Like, how did that make you feel in that moment, being so sort of resigned to the fact that you weren't going to go to jail?
It was just the inability to comprehend that period of time. I was literally living by the day, where I'd wake up and know that I had until 3 or 4 p.m. to make the money I needed to survive that day, to pay my employees, to pay my rent, to pay for dinner that night, whatever it was. And obviously the magnitude got huge in the months before Fyre and Fyre Festival, but I was literally living by the day for years. And now I was sentenced to 6 years. I just couldn't fathom like how long that period of time actually was. And that was the hardest challenge for me, which was going by daily survival to changing my mindset to now a 5, 10, 15-year outlook.
But I suppose more like maybe when you weren't actually given the sentence by the judge, but leading up to it, like, can you remember the moment where you were like, this is never going to happen? Like, I'm above the law, I can do whatever I want, to like facing the reality. Can you remember that moment?
I think it was internally and subconsciously always knew that I was going to jail. And
really,
there was probably outward behavior where I was trying to either lie to myself or lie to others, but I always knew where it was headed and where it was going to end at that point. So I think that behavior was probably more of a cover up and maybe like a mental massaging to myself to try to make myself feel better or more comfortable during a time that I was having difficulty handling.
Got it. And tell me a little bit about the prison experience. I understand that you went to solitary confinement on a couple of times. Can you tell me why that was and a little bit about that experience?
Sure. So I went to solitary twice for 10 months total. The first time I went for 3 months for having a USB device. I was trying to record a book and once again, broke the rules, didn't know how to exercise patience, and just sounds ridiculous. The second time I did a podcast interview from the prison payphone, and not a good idea, and went to solitary for 7 months for doing that interview.
And what was the hardest thing about being in prison?
The forced isolation from people you truly care about. Missing life moments, I think, is probably the most tangible aspect that's hard. If somebody gets sick, if somebody dies, if somebody gets married, both the really good and really bad moments of life, being forced to sit on the sideline and not being able to be there with the ones you care about is something you can't get back. But it also perpetuates this cycle of feeling useless. When you have 15 minutes on the phone and someone is saying they need you and the phone clicks off and now you're stuck and you're back in your bunk bed and you can't do anything. That is one of the most frustrating feelings as a human, to just feel utterly powerless and utterly useless to the people who you actually really care about.
Best thing about prison?
5 or 6 relationships that I will probably have for the rest of my life. I think that as a kid, I was taught, like many others, that there are good guys and there are bad guys. And I think naively, I believed that until I was 25 years old and went to jail and realized that, sure, maybe 5 or 10% of them are actually really bad guys, but the rest fall somewhere else on the spectrum where they were desperate and made a bad decision, but a lot of them still have a lot of good in them. Ultimately, a lot of really terrible people, but a handful of amazing people who changed my life while I was in jail. And then hopefully in the years to come, we'll reconnect. And I believe we'll be friends with them for life.
So Billy, you fuck up the first time with Fyre Festival, then you set up the other VIP ticket company as if the first situation wasn't enough. Then you go to jail. Then you get in shit again for doing the podcast, and then in shit again for the recording and the book, etc. It feels to me like there's this sort of incandescent, sort of habitual persona. You just couldn't help yourself, right? And like none of these hardcore, even the isolation, like it wasn't enough, right? You just kept on being Billy. I remember from another interview you saying that you're actually in jail when the documentary came out about Fyre Festival and you didn't want to watch it. So what I really want to understand is, like, at what point did you start to make some changes? At what point did you start to internalize a bit of remorse, a bit of humility, a bit of like, fuck, I actually need to start changing rather than just, pay people lip service, say the right thing, and hopefully I can just get back to where I want to be as quickly as possible?
It really took, I want to say almost a full year. And I'm not proud of this, but probably a full year of being in jail to start reflecting on the purpose and the why. And it really hit me during the first 3-month stint in solitary confinement. And I would have far before any of this happened, if you told me I was locked in a concrete box for 3 months and I list out the things that I missed, I would have probably been wrong about every single one of them. Like, you don't really miss the great food. You don't miss the big nights out. And you don't miss all the fancy stuff. It's you miss 3 or 4 relationships, and you miss sharing moments with 3 or 4 people. And in some physical way, I was stripped down to nothing, but also mentally, that 3-month stint stripped me down to nothing, where it was like a slap in the face of what's important. And at that point, I wouldn't have traded what I had or anything for a great experience or something tangible. I wouldn't trade what I had to spend time with 3 or 4 people who I really cared about. So I think that was the first almost awakening, where it's like, shit, here's what's really important. But the fact that my crime was essentially a violation of trust almost barred me from having what I cared about most. So that was kind of like a really tough come to light moment.
Yeah, that makes sense. And so in that moment, then what did you do? I mean, I guess you're having some therapy in prison. Do you start seeking help and guidance and trying to figure out how to make changes? Like, how did you go about all that?
I think letting go was really important. And for the first maybe year or so of the prison experience, I was trying to hold on to the life that I had, or the life that I thought I had. And whether that was trying to email or call or get visits from old friends and talk about business and talk about, the more fun aspects of life, that made it really difficult for me. So I think once I let go mentally, that kind of allowed I'm going to say, education process to really start kicking in.
And talk to me a bit about the therapy in prison. Did you have a lot of therapists? Was there one particular person that you had a relationship with, a good relationship with, different therapists, different prisons? Like, how was your experience there?
So one, it was a lot of reading. And I think it's very rare for us to be in the middle of our adult professional lives where we now have this much time to just sit and read and reflect. So that kind of like education process in a period where we don't typically have time to dedicate ourselves to education was pretty cool. But in a kind of like a surprising way, it was the other inmates who I think were the best, quote, therapists and the best people to really teach me, whether it was the ones who kept making mistakes similar to me and being able to observe that behavior and kind of connecting the dots to maybe my personal flaws, but also people who had come through all of it and were able to, hey, grab me and stop me and be like, hey, Billy, like, listen, like, here's where you're heading and here's why you have to change. So I think I would credit the inmates as like the best therapists throughout that process.
And what did they point the finger on, connecting the dots on some of those personal traits? Like, can you remember some of those realizations and the advice that they gave you?
I think it's a really simple advice from one person, which is that it can always get worse. And a lot of times you're like, okay, like this is rock bottom, but jail is a very rude awakening that things can always be worse. They can be worse physically, they can be worse mentally. And even if you think you're at your lowest point, like, they could drag you out of there and literally strap you to a concrete slab where you're peeing on yourself and can't move for days or weeks at a time. So it can always get worse, and understanding it can always get worse. And I think that's a really, really kind of helped me level set. And also like the purpose in the actions, like what's the goal, right? Is the goal to make these 4 years better, or is the goal to get out and to rebuild trust? And if my goal is to get out and rebuild trust, the short-term actions are far less important than kind of thinking for that long-term. So trying to shift my brain from daily survival, which I lived for so many years, to a longer-term outlook of actually making a positive impact.
Understood. And what about the psychologists and therapists? I guess you are assigned professional therapists in prison. Did you do that?
A little bit. I think prison more is up to you, right? There's a lot of people and you don't really get dedicated therapy sessions, but I think the overall experience is one giant therapy session, and it changed my life. And I think like I probably would have not gotten a lot out of a structured therapy session because I would have tried to fight against it, whether like mentally and not really absorb it. But when inmates that you respect or that you have to respect are the ones really teaching you, it's almost like a unexpected 4-year long therapy session that you have to embrace and really appreciate and grateful for how that just like I basically absorbed it and how it impacted me.
I feel like I'm getting like the surface level Billy. I appreciate we've never met before and stuff. I feel that I can really relate to you, Billy. I made some serious fuck ups in my time, and I could see kind of a bit of myself in you, and it was all I was obsessing about the admiration, the models, the private jets, the penthouses. I was kind of running around. I didn't realize it at the time, but I was running around, rushing. I was always anxious. I was never in the present moment. I thought I was God's gift. I was doing really well. Then it all went Pete Tom. And I suppose, I think I got into all that was the catalyst for me getting into all these different things. And I heard someone say once that the best entrepreneurs have two traits. They have a superiority complex where they think they're better than everyone else. They must be successful. And the other one is a crippling insecurity.
Interesting.
And there's a paradox there. And certainly those were, partially true for me. I definitely had a superiority complex and realized that I had some serious insecurities. And I realized a lot of that was driving a lot of these actions, and the need for love and the need to matter and the need to prove myself. And, all of that was because I felt that I wasn't good enough, because I couldn't just be at peace and be calm and be slow. And that forced me to cut corners and make mistakes. And I suppose I just want to understand a little bit about that and whether you've had some of those similar realizations.
I think the one point you mentioned there that I really agree with is the inability to be present is a great indicator for future bad behavior. And I think like in my worst moments and my most unethical decisions, and when I really went off the rails, I was going so fast and I was so anxious, and I just couldn't fathom stopping, being still, and understanding where things stood. And I was so focused on, okay, I need to do this because I need to get higher or bigger, or like level up or make more money, or do a better job marketing. And it was that consistent and constant rush that led to a lot of behavior. And in jail, when I saw a lot of people who maybe had similar tendencies, and when they were in that anxious, anxiety, unable to be present state, that's when they would go get in trouble in jail again too. So I totally agree with you there. And I was caught and lost in that and almost intoxicated in that anxious state for a period of time that led to a lot of the bad behavior. So I think that's spot on. And I probably also agree. I do kind of like thinking about the best entrepreneurs I know, or at least the most successful ones on paper. They definitely have a superiority complex. They're definitely super insecure. I think I'm not the best entrepreneur, but I definitely think I have those two flaws. So I understand you there. So yeah, I think like the challenge is how can we kind of channel that for good, right?
Yeah, and I guess it's almost a bit of an addiction, that rush and rushing and the rush. So how did you manage to slow down and start thinking? I mean, I heard in another interview that you would talk about 30 years, and it feels like you got a super sort of long-term mindset now. How did you shift from like tomorrow, this afternoon, super short-term quick fixes to a very long-term mindset?
Yeah, I think my seeking of the extremes is definitely a flaw I've had back then and have now too. And the extreme before was, let's put it all on the line. Like, let's bet the house. And, by 2:00, we're going to know if we're homeless or if we're billionaires. And I think now it's like, shit, I actually have 30-ish working years left in my life. And that's a lot of time. So why take those huge risks, or why sprint today when we have 30 years of a race ahead of us? So yeah, I think it's almost embracing that I know I'm going to gravitate towards the extremes. So let's gravitate towards that long-term extreme and not the extreme of it's all on the line like right now.
Yeah, makes sense. I know you read a couple of books a week. You're only allowed that much, weren't you, in jail?
Yeah, it's in solitary you were limited to 2 books a week, and I think to most working people that sounds like a ton, but when you literally can't leave your room, it is not much. So in a weird way, like the barrier to mental stimulation almost makes your mind more stimulated, and you seek knowledge and you seek learning more when you're told you can't do it. So that always kind of presented an interesting challenge in solitary. And for me, that led me to write. So I tried to teach myself how to write, and I would write dozens of pages every day, a lot of it gibberish, trying to write books. But yeah, I tried to like teach myself and almost really learn patience by trying to learn how to write. And I think the physical aspect of writing slows your mind down too, or at least it helped me slow my mind down, because like I can't think faster than my hand could go. So that was almost like a helpful meditative aspect of solitary.
That's really interesting. I didn't realize it was just the 2 books in solitary. So I guess you're able to read a lot more books outside.
Outside of it, correct, yeah.
I want to know, like, who inspired Billy McFarland, other than the other inmates, of course, but were there any particular books or authors or thought leaders or digital mentors that, you know, whether they're spiritual people or philosophical people or mentors, like who did you start sort of following and learning from?
I think there was one interesting book that was like part memoir, part fiction called Shanaram. And it was about an Australian guy who escaped maximum security prison, went to India, opened a doctor clinic in the slums, but also as part of like the Indian mafia, and was ultimately recaptured and went back to jail. And he wrote the book after he was recaptured. But I think the way that he told the wild tales of being on the run while dismissing his actions at the time was like really, really magical and interesting. So yeah, I think Shanaram was probably the most impactful book, but there's also plenty of time to, you know, read philosophy, read all of the standard classics, read a lot of fiction. So I think it was kind of like more of like an information dump, and then long periods where you couldn't do anything and you just had time to reflect on all that information.
Yeah, I'm jealous you read Shantaram. I've had it on my shelf. I tried to read it like 3 times because I know how I've been told by so many people how good it is, but it's a book that I just can't get into.
Yeah, it's amazing. Yeah.
Hi guys, I hope you're enjoying this episode. I just want to take 30 seconds to tell you a bit about my personal development company, Phoenix Mind. It's cliche, but years ago I had my own crisis moment which led me down a path of self-discovery, where I obsessed about all things wellness, psychology, philosophy, and spirituality. It took me 5 years. It was a total minefield, but in the end, the renewed clarity, direction, and peace totally transformed my life. But here's the thing. I was starting to notice more and more in the people around me the very traits and challenges that I was overcoming within myself. But I knew that most of them were never going to get into this stuff because it all sounds far too mumbo jumbo, especially a lot of my British mates. They're more likely to say, pipe down Charlie and have another half shandy. So I became like an investigative journalist, determined to demystify the mumbo jumbo and distill the very best bits from what I'd experienced firsthand to help save you time, money, cut through the BS, and understand how to really make change and create a better life. You can check out what I'm doing at charleylaw.com. My book Mumbo Jumbo, The 7 Steps to Making Change Happen, is due to be published later this year. And I've also curated a one-stop shop crash course self-development program called Beyond Mumbo Jumbo. We have a limited number of mastermind cohorts for driven business leaders and entrepreneurs who are looking for that accountability, camaraderie, and mentorship. Change your environment, change your life. Thank you so much.
I guess towards the end of your sentence, were you starting to sort of plan and you're getting a bit excited about like what next? And did you sort of create a strategy and a plan for exactly what you were going to do when you left?
For sure. I think a lot of the reflection was just being honest with myself about what I was good at and what I was really bad at. And I think it was a pretty simple equation where it's like, hey, everything I'm bad at, I'm going to get help and have great people kind of take the lead and guide me. But what I'm good at, I need to go all in and focus on that. So I always kind of knew that when I would get out and get back to the aspects that made some of the Fyre good or made some of my previous businesses good while just like getting outside help. I think the one biggest lie that I told myself in jail to help me get through was that I would walk out of the gates and the entire community and network from my past life would be standing there saying like, rah, rah, Billy, like, let's go get them. And the reality was there weren't really many people there. And it took almost a year to kind of get back to a quality group of people who would respect me enough to be with me on a daily basis. So lost a lot of friends, lost a lot of supporters, and it was much harder to kind of get back to a real solid support system than I expected it to be.
And what are your greatest strengths?
I think I'm really good at bringing people together in ways they can't do without me, whether that's an adventure in the Caribbean or just like, a cool dinner or work experience in New York City, just connecting people from different worlds, being able to connect people from totally different worlds and backgrounds, and then finding and kind of fostering good ideas when those people come together.
Cool. And tell me about the plan. Like, what was the plan as you left jail, and how's that panning out, and sort of where are you now?
Yeah, I have a love for the Caribbean, and Fyre started because for a few years prior to, I would take a couple of dozen people on these small island trips. They would be the fashion designer from Miami, the tech entrepreneur from New York, and these people who didn't know each other in their day-to-day life would connect on this remote adventurous island. And whether they got engaged and became husband and wife, they started businesses together. Like a lot of these relationships have stood the test of time and people have created a lot of value from them. So I've wanted to get back to that. Ultimately, I'd love to have a Fyre hotel or a series of Fyre hotels throughout the Caribbean that recreate and almost make permanent these trips. But we have to take steps to get there. So we are really trying to lean into the awareness of the Fyre brand and bring people together throughout these experiences. So, of course, we're doing a Fyre Festival. We're doing a Fyre Broadway musical. We're doing a couple of TV shows, all kind of built around this underlying theme of what ideas can people kind of create and share when they come together outside of their day-to-day life.
And how have you found the uptake, supporters, people buying tickets?
I think it's been a weird ride where 95% of people are very quick to hate or put down on the activities, but it almost seems to inspire the 5% of people behind the scenes who believe in like the ethos of Fyre, who believe that there could be a comeback, and they almost get motivated to prove the masses wrong. So interesting spot where it's like, I think my job right now is to just deliver as good of an experience as possible to those 5% of believers and, build my life around that.
So the thing is, Billy, I think that my observation is that Billy McFarland's got this gift, right? You've got this cheekiness, and I've seen it online and in various contexts, and this warmth that you have a incredible ability to persuade, inspire, and get people to do things and part with their money. It pops out even when in your most, the humility and the apologetic Billy McFarland, that cheeky grin and the smile comes out, that glint in the eye that was there, and managed to build everything that you built. But I guess, and I've seen it, that when people go through a process like you have, often they become a bit gun shy about the person that they used to be, because there are sort of negative attributions associated with that persona. And a lot of the time when people are going through transformation and making change and trying to reinvent themselves, before maybe they've got to the promised land and kind of know who they want to be going forward, one can get stuck in a bit of a no man's land when you're a bit earnest and you're a bit afraid and a bit gun shy of kind of taking the good bits from before and being confident about which bits you want and which bits that you don't want. But I guess going forward, like, that's a big talent of yours. So how do you think about knowing when to sort of pull the trigger and knowing when to bring that cheeky, charming, persuasive Billy out, and not feeling like shit, I'm going to get myself in trouble again, or people are going to look at me in a bad way?
Charlie, I think that like is literally the hardest part of life for me mentally right now. And really glad you touched on it. I met with an entrepreneur shortly after I got out of prison who's in his early 20s, by all accounts on top of the world. And I sit down with him and I come out of this meeting and said, like, this guy is absolutely crazy. Like, he doesn't understand that if this goes wrong, like all these things could happen. And then I look back at myself, I'm like, wow, it's like, I am jealous that I kind of know what can happen. And that will cause me to not have the risk appetite that this person does. And this person has a genuine chance of, literally changing the world in his industry. So I am very nervous that I lost the ability to pull the trigger on a risk that could really change my life or change other people's lives. And I think there's something to be said about someone being naive and not having that corporate downside experience that allows them to change the world. And if you look at all the best entrepreneurs, they were outsiders most of the time in the industries or the worlds that they came into that they tried to really change and attack. So yeah, I think my biggest fear is like, did I lose that? And every time I don't take a swing at something and a day later, like, wow, that actually would have been really great, but I was just too scared to do it. Yeah, it's definitely a mind fuck for me right now. And I feel like if I'd spent 20 years in prison, I'd be toast and like be totally scared of walking the wrong way down the road. So I am trying to balance that now, and that it keeps me up at night.
Yeah, I guess as you get older and more responsibilities and less time, you almost, it makes you think even harder. Like, is this the right thing? Like, I don't have 5 years to recover if this one doesn't work.
Exactly.
So almost you can riddle yourself with the perfectionism and overthinking and all of that sort of stuff.
Yeah, I think in the Walter Isaacson biography on Steve Jobs had a line that basically after 30, you lose the impulse needed for like crazy creativity. So I'm really concerned that like that line is actually true. And yeah, it's something I'm trying to fight against.
You got to lean into the fear, lean into the
exactly.
uncomfortable. I guess a big part of your MO now is surrounding yourself with good people and mentors and good partners. How have you gone about that, and have you been able to do that?
I think there's two things. One is time is the ultimate factor here. And no matter what I do, I can't remove this barrier of time where people just need to see me build trust. However, when I first got out of prison, I was almost reckless in the sense where I just shot a lot of nets out there and I reached out to everybody. And whether it was a cold DM, a text message from a number I found online, or from my own old phone book or emails. And I reached out to the people who I really dreamed of working with. And I think probably 3 or 4 months ago, it started trickling in where a few times a week, I would get a response out of nowhere. So this is 15, 16 months later. And people would be like, hey, you still up to chat, or you still game to meet? Or, hey, I'd love to talk, or I'd love to kind of hang out or get together and see what's up. So I think that like being a little naive and reaching out to people who clearly wanted nothing to do with me 15 months ago when I was first released, and not caring that most of them would ignore me or think I was crazy, combined with the factor of time, and now they're kind of reaching back out. That's been a really, really cool feeling.
And do you find that you're having to really persuade people a lot of the time that you aren't just making all this shit up, and you're not just paying lip service to people, and you're not just still a sociopath who's just playing the game? Like, how do we really know?
I think there's two buckets of people for me personally. The first bucket are people who I had known for a while. And I think like they know the good, they know the bad, and they don't need to be convinced of either side. Like they know what it is. And for them, probably it's a mix of like anger for how I violated their trust. It's part fear. It's, part risk of association. So I think they needed time to accept an apology or give me the opportunity to apologize. And then next is people who I maybe didn't work with or didn't know well before. And for them, they might see some of the good and obviously a lot of the flaws from afar, but they wanted to see trust or positive steps being taken first. And I'm a far way away from where I need to be to really be effective in life, but it does feel like it's finally starting to open up. And I credit that to a mix of just not caring that they would make fun of me when I first got out, to taking some positive steps along the way.
And I guess it must be hard when people call you things like a convicted felon, serial fraudster, sociopath. How does that actually make you feel?
It's horrible. But then I think if there is someone who I think I don't like let's say some public person who I might not agree with, and when I try to describe them, I often pick the worst thing they've ever done as a way to describe them. So like I get it. And the way that I try to, make it brush off my shoulder is being like, hey, I do the same thing and reminding myself like that's my defense mechanism. If someone really successful is out there and I don't agree with them or not so successful, whatever the case may be, and I label them to put them in a box to justify to myself why I don't like that person. So I think it's like our human behavior and our defense mechanism to protect ourselves. So understanding that it's been hard, but I think that also makes it the most doable on like a day in, day out basis.
What you went through, your body and your nervous system and your emotions, you were going through a traumatic experience. Yes, it was your own doing, but still your body and mind went through a traumatic shock through that process. I guess there was some trauma there, maybe some post-traumatic stress. Like, has that manifested in any sort of way, physically or mentally, in your life?
So I understand people have been through much worse, so I don't want to, overemphasize it, but the slight like PTSD, I think, has led to just irrational fear over silly things. Like, my grandma will say something to the phone, something to me on the phone. I'm like, oh my gosh, like if someone's listening, they're going to think she means this when she doesn't really mean this. Or, I jaywalk on the street. Oh, if I get pulled over by the police, like that's a violation of my probation. I'm going back to jail. So I think like all these little fears that are irrational definitely take a toll on your life, and it's getting better. But for the first year or so, like it was rough. And anytime someone said something to me, I would think about how it could be misconstrued to make it seem like I was committing a crime or doing something wrong. So yeah, definitely fearful of not being in control and fearful of seeing, what can happen when you do commit a crime like I did and you are up against something as powerful as this justice system.
And I guess going forward, am I right in thinking you're continuing to work on yourself and deal with, old demons and etc.? Are you continuing to work on yourself every day?
Yeah, so I actually do go to therapy now regularly, which is different. So, and I think like the way I've really embraced it, I'm like, wow, this is a forced pause, right? And I almost view it like, okay, you're back in prison for this session because you can't do anything else in life. You can't work, you can't be with friends, you can't be with family. Like you are here, and the rest of the world for me has to stop during this time period. And I found that to be really, really helpful and effective.
Wow, that's really interesting. And I mean, can you share any of those learnings? I mean, have there been any realizations about how that, where did this behavior come from in the first place? Like, have you gone into your past and your childhood and understood where those insecurities lie, and how those sort of micro decisions sort of led up to that moment? Have you been able to unpick that?
Definitely working on it. I don't think I have the answer. And if you can get out of me, then you'd be the best therapist. Yes, I think it's tough to pinpoint like all of the underlying factors, but it's very easy at this point to understand like what the flaws are. And I think you've articulated what a lot of those flaws are. And understanding how to combat those flaws, like a forced pause for me, whether it's once a week or twice a week where I have to like stop and think and just like can't do. That's been really helpful to, I think, quiet maybe some of the more like ambitious risks, even if they're not illegal or won't hurt anybody. It at least helps you double think something that might be too risky or too ambitious or a little too wild to do at this point in time. I almost remind myself of what the flaws are and then try to compare those flaws to the current decisions I have to make for that day or that week. And it's been a helpful like check and balance where it's like, okay, like this is your inherent flaw, and this means this decision probably is not the right one. Like let's pause on that. So if anything, the forced pause and the ability to compare and contrast the flaws that I have with my current like life events has been really helpful.
Yeah, I remember someone saying, or I read somewhere once, that most of man's or humans' problems derive from our inability to just sit alone in a room on our own with our own thoughts.
Interesting.
Like, most of us can't do it, and I think that because there's an uncomfortableness there, and that's why so many of us just go about our day and we're just trying to meet all these needs and
Yeah.
and fears, and in a hurry to escape and keep doing, and a human's doing instead of being. And I
No, I
think clearly,
definitely relate to that. I think like solitary is a great example too, right? Where after a couple of days or a couple of weeks, it's very obvious when you look back at where you went wrong and why you went wrong and how it was so silly and stupid. So, yeah, I think if we all paused, we would be able to quickly analyze all of our decisions and quickly point out the bad ones. So, yeah, agree with you that sometimes a forced pause could be literally life-saving.
interesting. Yeah, I have an online program, and at the very beginning, the first module, we just talk about how important it is to check out, to check in. Like, just you got to separate yourself from the busyness and the temptations and options and invitations and opinions of people. Just go somewhere quiet to just be still and quiet, and carve out and guard yourself from everything else, so you can just sit and reflect and introspect, because that's where most of the good stuff happens.
So one quick note on that. I love that. In jail, one of the biggest things that we all kind of laughed about and noticed was most people were very good at correctly giving advice to other inmates about their situation and giving them like really valid feedback. But when it came to their own situation, it goes, "Oh, I'm going to be free tomorrow and be a trillionaire and have 400 kids." But they were very bad at giving themselves any kind of practical advice or analysis based on where they stood. So, but if they like stopped and thought about it, they would realize they were sounding crazy. And I think that's a really, really interesting point, where we are often very good at seeing what's good or bad in others and what they should do, but we are deluded when it comes to ourselves in our current situations.
Yeah, I agree with that a lot. And there's that classic sort of self-development catchphrase where a lot of people are pointing at the other person, but it's not until you turn around and have that self-awareness to be self-critical, and that's where the vulnerability and the real learnings come from, and that's
Yeah, for
where
sure.
real change happens. You've been someone who has gone through a major life crisis, right?
Mhm.
And I think all sorts of people will or have done or are going through a major life crisis, whether it's financial ruin, maybe they're getting divorced, maybe loss, maybe it's a health situation, and that can be pretty disturbing and just completely set that person off the rails, and can be quite hard to come back from. What sort of advice would you give to someone that has just been absolutely derailed in life by a major life
Mhm.
crisis?
It's a really good question. And I just think the unfortunate reality is that it's almost easy and beneficial to come back from small setbacks, but it's very, very hard to come back from large setbacks. And most people just can't do it. So I don't want to sugarcoat. And I think like that's the toughest challenge. But I think also when you've been through something really bad, you almost realize that there is less to lose in life because you realize how precious each moment is and how short life can be and how fast the time really goes. So I think the silver lining of going through something awful is a desire to seize every moment you have left, knowing that there are just like not that many chances in life to, be a great family member, to be a great friend, to be a successful business person. So it's like go and seize every chance you can because shit can and often does go wrong.
And Billy, talk to me a bit about this restitution, because I
Mhm.
understand that you have an obligation, now you're out of jail, to pay back a sum of money to all the investors. How does that work? How much is it? And how does that make you feel?
Sure. So I really like to say publicly that my goal is to pay everybody back. And I think people often just take that as financial. And that is obviously a huge part of it. We can get into all of that. But by paying people back, I think it's atoning for my crime. And I believe that the worst crime I committed was this violation of trust. And like internally, I'll tell friends, like, hey, I want to go to dinner with this person or see them randomly in a room and shake their hand in 10 years. And we both know without it being said that like I did it, meaning I've like repaid that trust. Obviously, the financial aspect can't be ignored. I
How
owe
much is it?
I owe around 26 million back to investors who backed the first Fyre Festival, and the restitution is pretty simple. It's whatever I earn, a portion of that has to go back to those investors. And that's something I pay monthly. In addition to that, I am working to set Fyre up with various partners, whether it's a musical or a festival or a TV show, and dedicating a portion of those businesses back to the restitution as well. And I feel like if we really embrace the Fyre brand and work with great companies, that has the best chance of paying back that number in totality.
Okay, and in amongst all the various things you're doing under the Fyre brand, like, is the intention to do the Fyre Festival again in the Bahamas in the same way that you imagined it, but just executed properly?
Absolutely. So Fyre to me is more than a music festival. It's about this concept of taking people outside of their office in New York or London or South Africa, bringing them to a place they've never been with different people. And I think that has a lot of forms to it. And a festival obviously is one angle that we really need to nail. We will be working with an established music company who does festivals for a living. So it's not going to be me like setting up a tent or putting a stage together, but I will be powering the Fyre aspect of the actual event. So yes, part of this plan does include doing Fyre 2, targeting some point in the winter of next year in the Caribbean.
Am I right in saying that you're not allowed in the Bahamas at the moment?
That's correct, yes. We have a few location options. Ultimately, the decision will be made by our partner, but we have a few hospitality and nation, I could call it, partners who I think would be great for Fyre 2. So that's like my day-to-day job right now, is working on all those logistics, working with the partners and trying to get all that announced some point in Q1 of next year.
I mean, what do you even think about the whole mental health and personal development space, and that making change and transformation and psychology, spirituality, philosophy, that whole realm? What are your thoughts on it?
I think like if I put on, I'm not an investor or a venture capitalist, but I think like if I put on an investor hat, I would heavily argue that someone who embraces the philosophy and mental health aspect more has a higher chance of success than someone who dismisses it. And I was certainly someone who outright dismissed it in my worst periods of behavior leading up to Fyre and Fyre Festival. And I feel like my best decisions now are in times when I'm more in tune with it and embracing it further. So just from a pure like ability standpoint, I think there's a correlation between success as a person and embracing the mental health and philosophy aspect of just like being a human.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And going back to one of the points we touched on earlier about you potentially being a little bit gun shy about making the right decisions and pulling the trigger and showing that the charming, cheeky, persuasive Billy McFarland, do you have a process or systems in place, either sort of internal mental models or almost like decision-making matrix, or having to run certain things by people to kind of protect you from making similar mistakes that you've made in the past?
So I love to surround myself 6-7 years ago with people who were willing to strap the helmet on and just like run through the brick wall without asking any questions. And I look for people who are very similar to me in that mentality before. And I think while it's really important to have groups of people who can do that to try to make the impossible happen, it's also important that people who have authority and say are very different than you. My, partner on Fyre this time is someone who I've known and trusted for over a decade, but mentality and personality wise is much slower, probably more thoughtful on a day-to-day basis than me. And, always would rather take 2 weeks to make a decision rather than like do something today. So I think like having someone who's the extreme opposite than me, who I really respect, has probably been the biggest difference in my life. Whereas before, the people who I respected were too similar in strengths and weaknesses to what I had.
The thing is, Billy, talking to you, it's my true belief that everyone should be given a second chance. And you've certainly, you paid the price, you've done your sentence, you've got restitution for pretty much the rest of your, working career. And frankly, I really wish you well.
Thank you.
I believe you should have a second chance. I think people should give you a second chance. I suppose what I wanted to sort of say is, like, having said all of that, I rewatched the documentary because I wanted to refresh myself with it. But mate, you were so, deluded and obsessive about keeping on going and not caring and above the law and addicted to this way. And then we fast forward the clock to now, where, apparently you've learned all these lessons. Do you think it's really possible to change? Like, when it's so in you, like, do you really think it is possible? Are you constantly at battle with yourself about wanting to do things the old way?
So I think the first point here is that I don't think second chances should be given. I think they should be like taken or earned, right? Like, if someone does something atrocious like I did, we shouldn't immediately give me or someone in the same situation, a blank cart to go and try again. I think that person needs to go out and take the opportunity or earn that second chance. So yeah, I strongly believe that. Is it possible? I think it's really hard to come back from such a large ethical violation and large failure, and it's difficult. And I was looking at the numbers recently of people who have been convicted of financial crimes for similar amounts, and very, very few of them, if any, ever actually go out and pay back what is owed. And I understand the financial aspect is a small part of the moral violation, but very, very few do it. And I'm driven to be one of the few who makes it happen.
Good answer. Good answer. Well, Billy, I think it's been fascinating speaking to you, and I really appreciate you coming on, man. Like, I'm a small time podcaster, but I think it's just a fascinating conversation because, you are a controversial guy, and I think people will be interested to hear like what's sort of gone on internally, and watch and see whether this change is real and actions speak louder than words. So I'm really grateful for the conversation.
Thanks, Charlie. And I appreciate how difficult it is to cover Fyre. And I think that it's really easy to get distracted by some of the glossier questions. You were one of the few who I think dove way deeper than that and probably asked questions in a way I haven't actually heard before. So yeah, thank you. And you're certainly impressed by your interview style.
Oh, well, thank you, Billy. Well, I tried, I probed.
It was good. It was tough.
I feel there's a bit more there, and
it was very, very good. And you remind me of a podcaster who is one of the biggest in the world at conducting these similar interviews. And I think you guys have a very similar wavelength and ability to get past the surface level noise. So yeah, kudos to you.
Thanks, Billy. Well, look, good luck with all the endeavors. I know you're doing the marketing stuff as well at the moment, as the consultancy.
Absolutely.
And it'd be great to keep in touch, and maybe we'll get you back in a year or so's time, and you can tell us a bit more about your journey of growth. Because I feel that once someone gets in, has a major moment in life where a serious mindset shift, a change in values and beliefs, and that internal kind of motivator, that internal compass. There are big things changing inside of you, and I believe that it's something that you're going to continue to be doing and learning and evolving. So I think it'll be super interesting to see what else you get into and how you develop, and the wisdom and learnings and insight that you might be able to bring back for my audience at a later stage.
Amazing. Yeah, I think after Fyre 2, it'll be interesting for a check-in to see how values may be magnified or changed, with the success or failure of round 2. So that'd be pretty cool.
Well, I think it's going to be a case of not letting it go to your head, if and when it happens, letting it go to your head and keeping your feet on the ground.
Thank you, Charlie.
Thanks, Billy.
If you enjoyed the episode, please share the love and give us a cheeky follow, rating, like, or review. It really does make a massive difference. Don't be shy either to share any of your favourites on social media. This is a truly mission-driven project with the aim of helping to motivate, inspire, and give hope to as many people as possible that change, a better life, a new dawn is all possible. I genuinely love hearing from you and actively try to constantly improve things and bring guests on to address any specific themes. As always, you'll find resources and links from the episode in the show notes. You can follow me on all social media platforms as well as YouTube. And don't forget to check out my website, charleylaw.com. Until next time.